Well, while we're just waiting for the slide to change, I'm not going to talk about well, I'm Ray Playford. I'm a Vice Principal in charge of NHS matters at Queen Mary. If I could ask my colleagues just to introduce themselves briefly.
Yes, I'm Richard Ashcroft. I'm Professor of Bioethics in the Law School here at Queen Mary.
I'm Johanna Gibson. I met a lot of you earlier this morning. As well as QUEDOS Academic Director, I'm Professor of Intellectual Property Law in the Centre for Commercial Law Studies.
Thank you. We're going to talk about health in its broadest context, certainly in relationship to medicine, and how I'd like to chair this is we'll start off quite broad, thinking about the global aspects of health, but then come down to some particular examples that have been occurring in the UK and some things that have been in the news. So I would like input from the audience around this, because at the end of the day, it's the taxpayers that decide where the NHS spends its money, and there are going to be some very difficult things to decide. Perhaps if I can begin with what the definition of health is according to the World Health Organization. This is very much a utopian expression. Health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I think that's probably true, but there's very few of us probably that actually achieve that state of health. The World Health Organization has also said that it is a sort of a fundamental right of people to have health, but have put in the rider that it has to be in the context of their local environments, and that's something I'm going to ask the panel to talk about. And particularly important in that, modern medicine is very much underpinned by the medicines that we prescribe to people, and in general these tend to be very expensive. Even in the UK system, it's a major proportion of the NHS costs. And so one of the things is, do people in other countries have the right to health, the right to the same medicines as people over here? And also, for example, should the prices be the same in other countries as they are over here? So if we can open up with that general sort of discussion, perhaps from you, Richard.
There was a point around about 9:45 last night when I think I achieved health for about 5 minutes. I was at a fantastic concert, a certain amount of drink had been taken, and I was really, really enjoying life. This morning I'm paying for it, which I think tells something about health trade-offs of some kind. But the UN and WHO's system approach to health is framed back in 1946. And if you think about how the world's system thought about health back in 1946, it would very much have taken the view that much of what happens to you in terms of your health over your lifespan is not in anyone's control. It's not in your control, it's not in the hands of the pharmaceutical industry, it's certainly not in the hands of the government. So that definition serves as a sort of norm, Ray says a utopian one perhaps, for guiding where we ought to be going, an ideal that ought to pull us along and challenge us about what we are doing, without anyone actually expecting that we could say of the UN or the World Health Organization, look, it's failed because we haven't achieved health yet. And similarly, when you look at the individual state, you've got a similar approach. You can challenge your government to say, well, look, what are you doing to move us towards this goal? And how have you done since the last time we asked you this question? And the UN has a special rapporteur on the right to health. They've had two, which tells you something also interesting. This has only recently become something that the world system has wanted to do anything about. They will ask governments to report every 5 years. What have you done to move us along the goal? And the same with education, the same with poverty or housing or other rights of the economic and social type. So I think if you think about it as a kind of idealism in politics and a kind of idealism in international relations, and then you look at where does idealism actually play out in international relations, as we were hearing earlier on, that gives you some idea about what the international system thinks about health and how it wants to approach it. And this will turn out to be quite important when you look at TRIPS and intellectual property regulation of access to medicines.
Johanna.
I think what is very interesting about the definition of the right to health, and in conjunction with the concept of health, is that it is an inclusive right. So some of the points that were raised is that it's a right that incorporates all of the circumstances necessary for health. So that can include things like water and sanitation and environmental circumstances, as well as cultural circumstances. The right to health is something that incorporates not only the ability to access medicines, but also accessibility in terms of information, economic accessibility, And it also incorporates an acceptability, as both Richard and Ray have mentioned. It's about that cultural context in which a particular population exists, that healthcare is offered in such a way that it commands respect, that the advice is delivered in such a way that it is acceptable. And it is available. Healthcare has to be available. There has to be the facilities and so forth. And finally, there has to be the quality. And something that you might have seen in the press in the past few days was the decision of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence to refuse a second time to recommend a patented drug for the purposes of extending life in patients with advanced liver cancer. Now that drug is a patented medicine owned by Bayer. And the interesting part in talking about this is that Bayer attempted to negotiate the price, because the argument is that why put all of these, that's £3,000 a month, I think, to have this treatment. Why put all of that NHS money into that particular drug, which might benefit a few patients for a short amount of time, when there are other drugs that we could be extending where we have a greater indication of benefit? And that brings us to a very important issue that Richard raised, and that's the issue of price. What is the relationship between the price of a medicine and its benefit? And in fact, in 2007, the Office of Fair Trading issued a report on the pharmaceutical price regulation scheme, and said that it's not enough to go into these relationships with companies and try to negotiate a price, that is something that has no link to the benefit. It's just a commercial relationship based upon the market. We need to have value-based pricing. And the thing that's important about that, and it brings us back to the access to health and quality, is that it takes research away from this connection to the market, that you invest in a medicine simply because it has a profitable market at the end of the day. Instead, it's linked to the benefits. What kind of population will benefit from a particular drug? And Richard's point about access in different countries is very important here, because linking things simply to a profit at the end of the day will mean that there are huge areas that are completely neglected, and because they don't come with the same profit. And a lot of diseases in developing countries where there is perhaps less investment. This is a very real issue if we're looking in that international context of access to health. Can we make the system more efficient? How do we link price to the benefit? And if we think about patent rights for a moment, not that I want to belabor you with intellectual property too much, although I do see a lot of intellectual property friends in the audience, is what is the essential function of a patent? Why get a patent? Well, you've taken a risk, you've made an investment, you want to bring a drug to market. But how much money do you really need to make before you recoup that, before you've made that money back and a little bit more to continue that investment? And I think when Richard was mentioning intellectual property rights, are there special conditions in medicines? Are we looking at something different? I mean, we certainly have special conditions in medicines to deal with the regulatory delays for the purposes of the patent holder. So it takes a little bit longer to get things to market. You've got to get marketing approval. You have to go through very expensive clinical trials. And so for that, you can get some additional forms of protection. But what about the fact of the subject matter that you're dealing with?
Can I bring that to example of debate that's been going on in the NHS at the moment? As you say, this is just one example of an anti-cancer drug. They tend to be the very expensive ones. That in the UK, that you can have access to drugs that do seem to prolong your life for a certain amount of time if you can afford to pay for them. And there was a debate as to whether in an NHS ward, if you had two people in beds next to each other and one of them could afford to pay for it, would that be allowed? And the current regulations is that they can't have the private treatment while staying in that bed, but what they do, they get moved out for that course of treatment into a private wing, and then they can come back in and join back into the NHS. Do you think this is the right way for us to be delivering health?
Yes, it's interesting because it does create classes of patients, which is hugely problematic, especially if you are looking at it within the scheme itself, to have different classes of patients based upon economic accessibility. In those circumstances, then there really is a problem that the rights of those who can